The tourist crossed the line, both literally and figuratively. He threw coins at the feet of a royal guard, then stepped over the restricted line and tried to touch the horse, confident that his status as a tourist granted him the right to do anything. But when the guard took a step forward and coldly said, "Sir, you've crossed the line," the crowd froze. No one expected an ordinary day at the Tower of London to turn into a scene that would shock everyone, with video footage of the moment going viral worldwide. What did the guard do, and why did the tourist leave to a chorus of disapproving applause? Let's start from the beginning. The clouds hung low over the tower, as if they were about to join the eternal guard of this majestic place. The crowd at the foot of the royal guard looked like a swarm of restless bees. Cameras clicked, children screamed, and adults murmured and chatted in dozens of languages. The noise was chaotic, annoying, but Sergeant James Turner had grown used to it. James stood as a royal guard should, straight as if carved from stone, with his signature bearskin hat that seemed to add another foot to his height. His face remained impenetrable, though somewhere deep inside, perhaps, there was a flicker of fatigue from dealing with tourists who increasingly confused him with a live attraction. Amid the usual commotion, a voice suddenly cut through, loud, self-assured, with a distinct American accent. "Hey man, smile! You're here for us!" It was Steve, a typical tourist on a mission to capture the shot that he could post on social media. A middle-aged man in a t-shirt emblazoned with, "I love London." He stood right at the white line separating the crowd from the guards. His face radiated the smug confidence of someone who believed his status as a tourist gave him the right to do anything. Really? You flew in from another country just to disrespect traditions that have stood for centuries? Bravo. Just bravo. James, of course, didn't flinch. His glassy gaze was fixed ahead as if he hadn't heard a thing. But inside, it was a different story. Duty clashed with irritation, and years of service demanded one thing: patience. Pleased that his first attempt hadn't elicited a reaction, Steve took a step forward, as if to confirm the guard really wouldn't move. Stretching out his hand with a smirk, he said, "All right, if you won't smile, I'm at least gonna check out what this hat's all about." The crowd gasped. Even those who had been laughing moments ago now froze. Someone murmured, "He's not actually going to." Steve, of course, was. His fingers reached toward the furry headpiece as if it were a souvenir in a shop. Cameras began to flash faster. Some tourists eagerly awaited the guard's reaction, while others expected something extraordinary to happen. Seriously? You think this is a good idea? This is the Royal Guard, not an amusement park. Sure, we all want a selfie, but there have to be limits. But James didn't even twitch. His face remained calm, his gaze icy, like a frost-bitten January morning. And it was that very look that served as his answer to the tourist's audacity. "What's the matter, statue?" Steve pressed on, clearly relishing the attention. He winked at his friend, who had his phone poised and ready. "I came here for a show, and you're not even moving." The crowd was divided. Some chuckled, egging him on, while others looked on in disapproval. From somewhere off to the side, a woman muttered, "What a disgrace! Do people even understand where they are?" "Thank you, ma'am. At least someone else remembers that a guard isn't just a living statue, but a symbol of royal honor." James remained unyielding. Every muscle in his body seemed carved from granite. He was used to stunts like this, but that didn't mean he wasn't aware of how tightly the string of his patience was being pulled. "Smile for the camera, buddy!" Steve shouted again, his voice cutting through the crowd's noise. The guard made no response, but perhaps that was the most painful blow to the tourist's ego. Steve wanted a show, a reaction he could show off to his friends and followers. Instead, he was met with silent, icy disdain. And so, against the backdrop of thousands of photos and videos, noisy shouts and silent judgment, another day of service began for Sergeant James Turner. Steve wasn't done. Perhaps in his mind, there was an internal anthem playing, "I'm a tourist, and I can do whatever I want." With a mocking grin, he pulled a handful of coins from his pocket. The kind of coins people usually toss into fountains for luck, not under the feet of men symbolizing a nation's honor. The metal clattered against the cobblestones, creating an echo of shame that rippled through the crowd. "Hey man, buy yourself a smile," he jeered, his voice slicing through the silence like a knife. A few tourists stifled laughter, failing to grasp the gravity of the moment being captured on dozens of cameras. But others, shaking their heads, held back their outrage. Their gazes shifted from the glittering coins to James's face, all asking the same silent question. "How do you endure this?" James stood motionless, as though the coins shattered against an invisible wall of dignity. But inside, it was as if a spring-loaded mechanism of patience was tightening to its breaking point. Then, the scene took an unexpected turn. A small boy in a light-colored jacket, standing next to an elderly woman, suddenly began to cry. His thin, frightened wails cut through the crowd's noise. "Mommy, I'm scared," he sobbed, clutching his mother's hand as she frantically tried to pull him away from the shouting Steve. But Steve was too absorbed in his performance. Taking another step forward, he crossed the white line, the very boundary separating the guards from the public, preserving their sanctity. And he did it. The white line, symbolic of centuries-old tradition and respect, was crossed as if it were just chalk on the pavement. Really? Who does that? Steve was reveling in his moment of triumph. His chest swelled with confidence, and his friend's phone was aimed directly at James. The crowd held its breath, the atmosphere growing thick and tense. Then came the next twist. Spotting a horse belonging to one of the guards nearby, Steve decided to push his tourist rights even further. "Well, hey there, horsey! Let's be friends!" he shouted, reaching for the bridle. The horse, sensing the tension, shifted nervously from foot to foot. Its tail flicked like a warning flag. The crying child, noticing the horse's movement, screamed louder, clinging to his mother. The crowd froze. Those who had supported Steve seconds ago now exchanged uneasy glances, their smiles gone. A man from the back called out, "Hey, leave the horse alone!" But Steve just waved him off. James, despite the inner storm, continued to stand. His gaze was blank, but his hands, resting on his rifle, tensed slightly. Each of Steve's actions grew more dangerous to those around him, but the guard knew breaking protocol was an option only in the most extreme circumstances. How far will this guy go before reality hits him? James thought. Steve reached for the horse again, but this time its tail whipped sharply through the air. The crowd held its collective breath, and someone in the back murmured, "Now we're gonna see a show." James appeared to summon every ounce of willpower to withstand the moment. His gaze remained unshaken, but his body braced itself, ready for whatever might come next. The crowd waited, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Steve reached out toward the horse, smiling smugly, as if it were a personal prop in his performance. He didn't even notice the crowd holding its breath, sensing the inevitable. But James did. Just a moment ago, he had stood as motionless as a statue, but now he took a step forward, breaking his usual immobility. The step was swift and deliberate, so much so that even the wind seemed to pause. The line between the guard and the tourist turned into an invisible boundary that should never have been crossed. "Sir, you've just crossed the line," James said. His voice sounded like thunder cracking the sky over London. The crowd gasped. No one expected the royal guard to break his stillness, but it happened. Not for himself, for the horse, for tradition. Steve stumbled back a step, his face twisting in surprise before his smirk returned. Clearly, this guy wasn't ready to back down. "Oh, look! The guard broke character! So, what are you gonna do now?" he yelled, pointing his phone camera at James. "Really? A phone? As if that's your shield against shame? Do you honestly think everyone around you supports your foolishness?" James stood firm, as solid as a stone wall. His eyes, cold and focused, bore directly into Steve. "Step back behind the line, immediately," James commanded, his voice carrying the weight of an order that could not be ignored. Steve tried to fire back, but suddenly a sharp voice rang out from the crowd. "You're disgracing yourself and your country!" It was an elderly woman holding the hand of a crying child. She stepped closer to Steve than anyone else had dared, her gaze full of indignation. "This man has more honor in one step than you've shown in your entire life," she added, her words slicing through the air like a blade. The crowd erupted into applause. People began to rally behind the woman. Some shouted words of approval. Others pointed at Steve, demanding he leave. Steve suddenly realized he was no longer the hero of his own story. The crowd was condemning him now. Cameras which moments ago had been focused on the guard were now aimed squarely at him. "Well, great provocateur. This show definitely isn't ending the way you imagined." James slowly returned to his position. His face was once again impenetrable, but his eyes remained cold. He knew he had done the right thing, and that certainty gave him inner peace. Steve, confused and humiliated, began to back away under the scornful stares of the crowd. For him, the performance was over, but for James, it was just another day of defending honor and tradition. Steve stood there, bewildered, clearly unprepared for the backlash. His attempt to defend himself sounded pathetic and incoherent. "Come on, it was just a joke," he stammered, but his words were drowned out by the crowd's outraged shouts. "A joke? Really? You just crossed the line, both literally and figuratively, and now it's all a joke. Of course, tourists can do whatever they want, can't they?" But the crowd no longer supported Steve. The elderly woman who had rebuked him moments earlier stood with her child, her expression filled with disdain. The tourist cameras and phones were no longer focused on James, but on the humiliated Steve. Someone yelled, "Get out of here! What a disgrace!" On social media, the first videos were already appearing with bold headlines like, "Tourist humiliates Royal Guard and gets what he deserves." Meanwhile, James calmly returned to his post. His movements were as precise and deliberate as his sense of duty. He adjusted his bearskin hat as if he had merely stepped over a pebble on the road. The crowd fell silent. James's face remained impassive, but within, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't a victory over Steve, it was a victory over chaos and disrespect. The guard isn't here for entertainment. He's a living piece of history, a symbol of discipline, and today, that history remained unshaken. Steve, realizing his show was over, tried to leave, but his exit was met with boos and jeers. One tourist shouted loudly, "Off you go, hero of the day!" As Steve finally disappeared from sight, the tension in the crowd eased. Someone even made a sarcastic comment. "What's next? Tea with the Queen?" murmured a tourist to their companion, and those who heard it chuckled. James resumed his steadfast stance, as if nothing had happened. His silhouette against the backdrop of the tower seemed to embody order, discipline, and centuries of tradition. But despite his apparent stillness, the moment did not go unnoticed. Someone in the crowd clapped, then another. Within seconds, applause filled the square. Not just a gesture of admiration, but an acknowledgement. People were applauding not only James, but the very idea that respect still mattered. The story ended symbolically. The guard remained true to his duty, while the one who dared challenge tradition walked away under a storm of well-deserved condemnation.